It is my distinct pleasure and honor to be giving this introduction for Duong Van Mai Elliott. Mai was born in Vietnam and grew up in Hanoi and Saigon. She attended French schools in Vietnam and is a graduate of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She is the author of The Sacred Willow, 4 Generations in the Life of a Vietnamese Family, published by Oxford University Press in 1999, which is a personal and family memoir nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. The book vividly captures the realities of life in Vietnam across decades of historical change and turmoil. In it, she deftly explores complicated notions of identity as local life underwent generations of national transformation and modernization. Her second book, Rand in Southeast Asia, A History of the Vietnam War Era, chronicles the think tank's involvement in research about the Vietnam War at the behest of policymakers in Washington, D.C., and explores the impact of this involvement on Rand itself. The volume chronicles Rand's research of insurgency and counterinsurgency in Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand during the Vietnam War era, and assesses the effect that this research had on US officials and policies. To give you an idea of how these 2 publications have been received, I offer the following. About her family memoir, the New Yorker magazine stated that it is as engrossing as fine literary fiction and indispensable to understanding Vietnam from a Vietnamese perspective. In a 2016 podcast, author Malcolm Gladwell called her family memoir beautiful and her book about Rand brilliant, and listed both on his podcast website as recommended readings. Mai is a frequent speaker and writer on Vietnam. She recently contributed a chapter for Cambridge University Press 3-volume work on the Vietnam War, and has also recently completed a novel on Vietnam in the early 1960s. Mai also recently served as an advisor to filmmaker Ken Burns for his documentary on the Vietnam War, which aired on PBS in September 2017, and she was featured in 7 of the 10 episodes of the film. Without question, she is one of the world's most influential voices on Vietnamese society and recent history. On a very personal note, she has been a source of tremendous inspiration for me. As a Korean Vietnamese American who was born in Saigon and arrived in the US with my parents as refugees fleeing the war, I have grappled with my own notions of cultural identity, heritage, and family ancestry. Her work and life story serve as a model for how one might come to terms with complex past histories, and for that I offer my deep thanks. A month ago, my parents and I watched the gripping and heart-wrenching scenes coming out of Kabul. Like many other refugees in the US, I'm sure, my parents had flashbacks to their own experiences evacuating from Saigon amidst utter chaos and uncertainty. And like all of you in attendance here today, I now look forward to hearing Mai Elliott's thoughts on the eerie comparisons between 1975 Saigon and 2021 Kabul. Please join me in giving Mai Elliott a warm and virtual welcome.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for coming today. So let's get started. Let me point out right away that I know more about Vietnam than I do about Afghanistan. I've studied the history of the Vietnam War, but I'm only an observer of the war in Afghanistan. So today I'm just going to discuss the differences and similarities between South Vietnam, Americans' ally from 1954 to 1975 in the fight against the Viet Cong guerrillas and their North Vietnamese communist allies, and Afghanistan, and between the war in Vietnam and the war in Afghanistan as I see them. So first of all, South Vietnam as a country was very different from Afghanistan. The first 2 slides, please. So South Vietnam was a country with more resources and a more literate people. It had a central government and a centuries-old tradition of centralized government. It had an organized army. It was a unified country. There were ethnic and religious differences, but on the whole, the country was unified. In Vietnam, the United States faced a more formidable and unified enemy. North Vietnam was an organized country, and it had a large and disciplined army. The communists in Vietnam enjoyed popular support because they had defeated France in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu to liberate the country from colonialism. Next slide, please. North Vietnam also had the support of the Soviet Union and Communist China, two superpowers during the Cold War. In Vietnam, the United States had to fight a much bigger war. It sent 500,000 troops to South Vietnam to fight the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. The violence of the war was much greater. The battles were a lot bigger and more ferocious. American combat troops had to battle large North Vietnamese units in places like Ia Dran. Next two slides, please. The Vietnam War reached deep into American society because of the draft, and so had a much bigger impact on American society. The violence and killing appalled a large segment of the American population and provoked widespread opposition. The war in Afghanistan after the Iraq invasion became a forgotten war because the United States by this time was relying on a volunteer army. The war in Afghanistan only affected about 1% of the American population, and most Americans did not pay a lot of attention to the war in Afghanistan until the final outcome this year. In 2011, when Osama bin Laden was killed, there was a spike in interest, but then that interest began to wane. The most striking similarity, of course, between Afghanistan and Vietnam was the final outcome. So after years and years of investment in blood and resources, the United States could not defeat its enemies, and running out of time and patience, it withdrew, leaving client states that it had spent decades to build and support to fall. So in Afghanistan and Vietnam, therefore, we can say that history did repeat itself. But the route that the United States took to get to the end of these wars was different. First, let's take a look at the sobering statistics of the cost of the wars to the United States, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. And from these statistics, the Vietnam statistic, you can see how much more destructive the war was for both the United States and Vietnam. 58,000 US soldiers killed, 150,000 wounded, and then look at the casualties in Vietnam and the number of refugees. And so you can see how much bigger that war was, and the consequences of the war were much more serious. Next slide, please. So now you compare those statistics with the statistics of Afghanistan, and you can see that, even though the casualties were serious, they pale in comparison to the casualties in Vietnam. Also in Vietnam, the United States dropped a lot of bombs. So the tonnage that was dropped in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was, according to some people, as much as the total tonnage dropped during World War II in Asia. So what happened? In both wars, the United States committed the same blunders: misjudgment of the situation, hubris, misplaced belief in nation building, unwarranted optimism, and Americanization of the war. So in Vietnam, the misjudgment occurred in the context of the Cold War. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union and Communist China began to espouse wars of national liberation or insurgencies to subvert countries in the underdeveloped world, which were unstable, poor, and rife with corruption. The Kennedy administration thought that the Soviet Union and China, the communist bloc, was using this new type of warfare to nibble at the periphery of the Western world and eventually threaten the United States and its core European allies in a domino fashion. And at the same time, avoiding a direct thermonuclear confrontation with the United States. So in Asia, the Kennedy administration was pursuing a policy of containing China to keep it from expanding communism to other nations. So in this context, the Kennedy administration mistook the Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam as a proxy war by China to expand communism. And North Vietnam, the United States viewed North Vietnam as a surrogate for China. So, but this was a misjudgment because what was going on in South Vietnam was like a last phase of a post-colonial struggle to reunify Vietnam, which was divided after the French was defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So the United States decided to intervene in a mistaken belief that its resources, its military power, and its smarts could succeed where the French had failed. So Kennedy ignored President Charles de Gaulle's advice to him in 1961 to stay out. Besides hubris, Kennedy was also motivated by the fear that he would be saddled with the legacy of being the first American president to lose a war. After China was lost to communism in 1945, every US president, including Kennedy, was afraid of being accused of losing another country to communism. So in Afghanistan, the context was the war on terror. After the attacks on US soil on 9/11, the United States was angry, humiliated, and eager for revenge. And it wanted to find the perpetrators and punish them. It gave an ultimatum to the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden or face American bombs. And when the Taliban refused, we bombed and then we invaded. Next slide, please. So in Afghanistan, we also suffered from hubris. In 2001, the Taliban offered to surrender in exchange for amnesty. We refused. We thought they were finished and we wanted to wipe them out, and we wanted their leader captured or dead for having refused to hand over Osama bin Laden. In our anger and thirst for revenge, we ignore the history of Afghanistan as the graveyard of empire. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we're missing oh, there you go. Thank you. But both in Vietnam and Afghanistan, we found out that it was easy to get in, but difficult to get out. In the words of a former American official in Afghanistan, we found ourselves stuck in what he called a lobster pot. We came storming in, but we got stuck in a quagmire. We faced the options of staying at great cost in blood and resources, or getting out by building a local government and a local army that could survive and take over the war and allow us to leave. So we embarked on nation building, believed that it would work. So when President Lyndon Johnson dispatched US Marines to Vietnam in 1965, at least he found a government already in place. So this government was inept, corrupt, and unpopular, but it was already there. South Vietnam also had an army. And though this army suffered from weak leadership and it had a morale problem, but it too was already in place. So the United States thought that all it had to do was prop up this government and this army until they could stand on their own feet and allow us to leave. But this government and this army, unfortunately, suffered from the stigma of being the creation and the tool of foreign invaders and occupiers. So it had trouble rallying the people for the fight against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. The same thing could be said about Afghanistan. The government and the army there also had to labor under this stigma. Now, in nation building in Afghanistan, the United States encountered a lot of problems. First of all, Afghanistan was a poor and backward country. In the words of Condoleezza Rice, President George Bush's national security advisor, Afghanistan society was still mired in the 7th century rule of the Taliban, and it was still recovering, if at all, from 30 years of first war. So Afghanistan was also beset by ethnic, tribal, and religious divisions. And after the Taliban were routed from Kabul, there was no government to take over. So the United States had to create a government and an army from scratch. At the same time, it had to deal with warlords and all the tribal and ethnic differences. So Afghanistan's only viable resource at the time was opium cultivation, which the Taliban eventually would use to finance their insurgency. So in order to drag the society, in the words of Condoleezza Rice, into the 21st century, the United States had to spend enormous sums of money. Under President Barack Obama, the spending reached its peak after he ordered a search in 2009. We pumped so much money into the country, and it is a small country, that Afghanistan could not absorb all the money, and corruption soared. According to an estimate that I've seen, up to 40% of the money went into the pockets of corrupt officials, senior military leaders, the elite, crime syndicates, and even into the pockets of the insurgents who were paid not to attack. But both in Afghanistan and in South Vietnam, after spending all this money, we only succeeded in creating client states, which were totally dependent on American aid. The American aid benefited mostly, like I said, the corrupt officials, military leaders, and the elite in Kabul and Saigon. Kabul and Saigon experienced a wartime boom, but the countryside suffered. It bore the brunt of the death and destruction. And it was this suffering that drove many to support the insurgents and even to join them. In South Vietnam, during the period of direct American military intervention, up to 4 million people a quarter of South Vietnam's population at the time were displaced from their homes in the rural areas. In Afghanistan, the UN Refugee Agency estimated that 3.5 million people in the countryside were displaced. So another mistake we committed in both wars is that we were overly optimistic about the prospects for success. So time and again, American civilian and military leaders painted a rosy picture of the situation on the ground. They cited progress in pacification in Vietnam and in stabilization in Afghanistan. They talk about the progress of the war. The American people were told there was light at the tunnel in South Vietnam and that the enemy was on the ropes. In Afghanistan, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared, quote, the end of major combat on May 1st, 2003. But in 2006, the Taliban staged a resurgence and violence flared. Over the years, officials cited progress in recruiting and training the Afghan forces and the building of schools, clinics, and roads as signs that we were winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. But the enemies we faced in Afghanistan and in Vietnam were resilient. And they kept rising from the ashes of battle, and they kept coming back. In Afghanistan, the Taliban fled to Pakistan, where they regrouped and rebuilt, so that by the time we withdrew in 2021, they were stronger than when we found them in 2001. They didn't give up because they believed they had the blessing of Allah to free Afghanistan from the American occupiers and to defeat the Afghan government and army because they were tools of the infidel Americans. So in Vietnam, the United States had to fight an organized, disciplined, and strong adversary in the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese communists, who were seasoned fighters after having defeated France during a 9-year war of independence struggle. I guess we've seen the slide of the Viet Cong fighters earlier. So the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, like the Taliban, had a strong will to fight because they believed in what they call their just cause, which was to expel the Americans, overthrow a government which they viewed as unjust, and to reunify the country. They also believed that they had no choice but to fight to defend themselves, their families, and their homes from the American invaders and occupiers. So in the meantime, American officials were complaining about the Afghan security forces. They complained that they were incompetent, unmotivated, poorly trained, corrupt, and riddled with deserters and infiltrators. So such a description could have been applied to a big segment of the South Vietnamese army. Also, both the communists in Vietnam and the Taliban believed that if they did not give up, if they did not lose, they would win in the end. They knew that time was on their side because they knew that the Americans could not stay forever and that the Americans would leave in the end. And when the Americans leave, the local government and army would collapse. So as the Taliban was fond of saying, the Americans have the watches, but we have the time. So in the end, this greater will to fight was the determining factor in the Taliban and the communists achieving victory. So another mistake we committed was in Americanizing the war. In building up the armed forces of South Vietnam and Afghanistan, we built an army that resembled our own army with heavy reliance on air support and logistical support. So we've seen the slide of the South Vietnamese army, and now we're looking at the slide of the the Afghan security forces. So in short, we created an army that became used to fighting the war the way we fight the war, a war that neither South Vietnam nor Afghanistan had the resources nor the technical know-how to sustain. They had trouble maintaining the advanced weapons that we've provided to them. And in an essay that a former Afghan commander wrote in the New York Times, he said, quote, "The Afghan forces were trained by the Americans using the US military model based on highly technical special reconnaissance unit, helicopters, and airstrikes. 17,000 American support contractors in Afghanistan maintained the bombers and attack and transport aircraft. When they left, the Afghans were unable to maintain these weapons and had to fight without, in the word of the commanders, without the aerial and laser-guided weapon capacity they had become used to rely upon." So American support provided a psychological lift to the Afghan and South Vietnamese forces, but at the same time, the support created a sense of dependency. So when we left, both the South Vietnamese and the Afghan forces felt bereft. So what led the United States to withdraw from both wars? So under pressure from the American people and the US Congress to withdraw from an unpopular and unwinnable war in Vietnam, President Richard Nixon had to withdraw combat forces. But he knew the dangers of withdrawal, so he did it gradually. And as he began to withdraw American forces, he actually enlarged the war. He invaded Cambodia to destroy the Viet Cong sanctuary there. He carpet bombed North Vietnam in 1972 with B-52s to degrade its fighting capacity so that South Vietnam could survive for a time after the United States withdrawal. So in 1972, President Nixon met with Mao Zedong in China and ushered in a period of détente and rapprochement with China. So the rationale for intervening in Vietnam to contain China no longer applied. We no longer had to be in Vietnam to contain China. So the issue became how to disengage without damaging American image and credibility. So before President Nixon, let me backtrack a little. In January 1973, President Nixon signed a peace accord with the North Vietnamese in Paris. So in exchange for the return of American POWs held in Hanoi, he would withdraw all of US forces. But before he did so, he rushed billions of dollars worth of weapons to South Vietnam. And in order to beef up the South Vietnamese forces to survive for what he called, or Henry Kissinger called, Henry Kissinger was his national security advisor, if you recall. He did all this in order to strengthen South Vietnam to survive and buy what he called a decent interval, or Kissinger called a decent interval, a decent period between American withdrawal and the final collapse. So in Afghanistan, in 2011, we killed Osama bin Laden. So that was a time when we could have declared mission accomplished and withdraw. But again, President Barack Obama knew the dangers of withdrawal. So even though he promised he would end the war by the end of his term, when he left office, there was still over 8,000 American troops left in Afghanistan. So this pattern of presidential decision-making, of just doing enough to stave off disaster and pass on the problem to the next president, existed throughout both wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan. So even before he took over, before he entered office, President Trump was advocated the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Even back in 2011, he advocated getting out because he believed that Afghanistan was not worth fighting for. So in February 2020, he signed a peace agreement with the Taliban that said that the US would withdraw all American troops by May 2021. He also released 5,000 Afghan prisoners as part of the deal. Next slide, please. Next one. This is these, whoops. Can you backtrack a little? Okay, well, let's stop there and see whether I can catch up with the slides. So in Vietnam, after the Americans withdrew, the South Vietnamese did last for another 2 years. So in January 1975, in January 1975, the North Vietnamese attacked a provincial town as a probe, a test to see whether the United States would send B-52s back, but it did not. So the North Vietnamese then launched their final offensive in March of 1975, and they attacked in the Central Highlands, which is the mountainous regions of South Vietnam. So General Thieu, who was then president of South Vietnam, committed a tactical blunder. He ordered a retreat from the Central Highlands, but the retreat was badly planned and badly executed, and it turned into a rout from which the South Vietnamese army could never recover. So the North Vietnamese were stunned. They thought it would take them until 1976 to achieve final victory. But the South Vietnamese army gave up the fight, and South Vietnam collapsed in a matter of weeks. So by the end of April 1975, the Saigon government surrendered. So this is the slide of the offensive by the North Vietnamese in 1975. Next slide, please. So this is a chaotic evacuation of South Vietnam. There was panic, when the North Vietnamese advanced so quickly. And President Nixon at one point had talked about a bloodbath if the communists took over. He used that argument to justify staying on in Vietnam, but also to kind of motivate the South Vietnamese to fight harder. But now that prediction also triggered panic, and a lot of people wanted to get out. Next slide, please. Next one. So after the Saigon government surrendered, the communist tanks rolled into the presidential palace. And next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we already talked about the agreement that President Trump signed with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar. So with the signing of the agreement and the withdrawal of American forces, there were fewer Americans to fight. So the Taliban began to seize more territory, and eventually they control most of the country. In April 2021, President Biden declared that the United States would withdraw completely from Afghanistan on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attack, and that the withdrawal would begin in May 2021. These are American forces withdrawing from Bagram in July of this year. So the Taliban began to attack cities, and they advanced very quickly. They seized one city after another. And instead of fighting the Afghan forces, numbering about 300,000 to the 60,000 Taliban or so, abandoned the fight, even though they were much better armed than the Taliban. And the Taliban then, kept advancing. So let me see the date here. I think that in August, actually on August 10th, American intelligence warned that it would take 30 to 60 days for the Afghan government to collapse. But 5 days later, Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, fled. The Taliban entered Kabul on August 15. Next slides, please. So this is the eerie juxtaposition of the chaotic evacuation in Saigon and in Afghanistan. So what is the main reason for the collapse? So after they fled to the United States in 1975, a number of former senior Saigon high-level civilian and military officers, when they were interviewed, they cited the reasons for the quick collapse of South Vietnam. They mentioned several mistakes by the United States, but in general, they agree that it was the endemic corruption and the lack of leadership of the Saigon government that led to the final collapse. They call this corruption the cancer that finally killed South Vietnam. A few of the former Afghan senior officials also pointed their fingers at their government. The Afghan commander who wrote the essay in the New York Times blamed the collapse mainly on, and I quote, the well-documented corruption that rotted our government and military that really is our national tragedy. The endemic corruption in Mr. Ghani's government and in the senior military leadership crippled our forces and hobbled us. These civilians and military leaders could not, quote, inspire the confidence and trust of the troops asked to risk their lives. In the end, these troops decided not to shed blood for a government they did not believe in. So in both South Vietnam and Afghanistan, the United States, despite massive investment in blood and money, in the end, failed to prevail militarily and to create a government capable of winning the trust and the hearts and minds of its people. A government that could survive on its own after America realized the futility of its involvement and left. So in this respect, history did repeat itself. If you want to know more about the US government's lack of transparency in both the Vietnam War and the Afghan War, I would urge you to read the Pentagon papers and the Afghan papers. They contained secret assessments of what went wrong in both wars. Thank you for your attention.